Undoubtedly for me, one of the most exciting games to come out of this year's E3 was the announcement of Resident Evil 7, scheduled for release on January 24th, 2017. Now, I've had a very shaky relationship with this franchise, and personally condemn Resident Evil 6 as being a forced experience that tries to be everything, but fails at being anything, but also gave considerable praise to both RE4 and 5. For one, the series has always been quite tonally and stylistically inconsistent, starting as a survival horror before mixing it up with more action-oriented adventures. But it's always been one of those franchises that almost has something for everyone, if indeed it's become estranged from a certain portion of its original audience. In an interview with IGN, RE7's producer and director even admitted that the game spawned out of an evaluation of the series' long-lasting identity crisis, by stating that by trying to please everyone, you please no one, acknowledging the general discontent over RE6, which awkwardly tried to employ horror and action, only for the horror to feel desperate and the action to feel unfitting. For me, and I'm sure many others, the announcement came as a pleasant but expected surprise, as we were treated to a dark and brooding demo that, according to the game's creators, aims to set the tone for the new game as a return to survival horror. That said, it certainly has polarized many more vocal gamers regarding the direction the new game is going, but it also poses the question as to whether it can bring back the horror this series lost. Now, according to the game's developers, it's a complete reinvigoration of the franchise, by returning to the roots of Resident Evil 1, which shows confidence given that RE7's game director also approached Revelations the same way, and was subsequently praised by many critics and fans for recapturing the atmosphere of the original game. This information is also enhanced by the fact that Spec Ops The Line narrative designer Richard Persley, I may have pronounced that wrong, will be writing the story, so I do hope that they can capture the Spec Ops magic by using the environment as a tool for narrative complexity, and judging from the trailer, this seems to be very true indeed. Now, there is a lot to be said about the demo, but I want to draw your attention to the developer's cinematic inspirations of 1970s and 80s horror films. Just looking at the demo, it reminded me of John Carpenter's Halloween meets Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is, of course, immediately fascinating for any horror fan, especially with the use of light, environmental design, and the sense of authenticity it presents. By authenticity, I mean it feels very real and visceral. Then, of course, you have to acknowledge that there is no escaping the presentation's seemingly deliberate attempt to invoke the same reaction as Kojima's PT demo from Sony's press conference in 2014, with its non-intentional stylistic similarities and marketing tactics, regardless of the fact that RE7 was in development before PT. But honestly, I have to say, it works quite well. Granted, there is certainly its comparisons to PT, with its jump-cutting ghost-like figures, stark saturated color palette, and dim torch vigneting the screen to make everything appear more claustrophobic, but it's the lighting I find particularly impressive. Now, there always seemed to be this horror race between Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but both games had very distinguishing features, and a major element of that was atmospheric lighting. Silent Hill was driven by intense isolation through fog and limited lighting, whereas Resident Evil always had a more blunt, saturated art style where everything felt normal and undisturbed. And for one, the sunset in the trailer reinforces the subtleties of that distinction, because Resident Evil felt more like time was progressing, whereas in Silent Hill, everything feels static. And just to test it, play both demos and see if you can find that time distinction. Now, getting back on track, I've honestly been craving a horror that uses daylight to genuine effect. In cinema, a few good daytime horrors, if you will, were The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as mentioned before, The Wicker Man, and more recently, It Follows. In The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, daytime was used to add a sense of believability to its setting. It never feels deliberately set up to invoke scares, but instead creates this unorthodox sense of reality. I mean, nobody assumes the daytime to be scary, so it's a flip on the formula. The RE demo follows a similar style, and the way that daylight seeps through windows and walls makes the player feel trapped and closed off from the outside world. If they make it work, especially with the strong atmospheric moments such as the beautiful use of fog to accentuate the rays coming through the Venetian blinds in the kitchen, it gives the game a more unique selling point than purely being derivative of other horror games that rely on the same aesthetics. Of course, I don't anticipate the game to be abundantly set during the daytime, but it certainly adds a nice unique stylization that we rarely see in horror. For example, the game is set in the American South and appears to take on Southern Gothic conventions, which of course the Texas Chainsaw Massacre did as well. What I've always found intriguing about the use of the American South in fiction is the desolate environments and the lack of civilization. It always makes characters feel vulnerable and exposed, and there's something very disturbing about the quiet emptiness of it all, and even the feeling of abandonment and dilapidation of many areas. I feel like we haven't had a decent AAA haunted house game in quite some time. There was The Evil Within, directed by the original creator of Resident Evil, Shinji Mikami, but where that game struggled was in trying too hard to retain and mimic the horror and functionality of Resident Evil 4 that it never felt like its own unique game. Hence, I'm kinda shaky about the future of that franchise. However, something that has really struck more vocal gamers is how the game doesn't feel like Resident Evil, and a big part of that is the switch to the first-person perspective. Resident Evil 7 is now built with the intention of supporting VR as well, and it seems to want to take advantage of the new technology to enhance its fear factor, so I'm assuming Capcom wants to set the benchmark for horror on VR, at least for PlayStation. Speaking with GameSpot, the game director argues that first person makes encounters more up close and personal, but it has appeared to alienate a lot of fans who were more familiar with third person. Now, personally, I'm extremely welcome to the idea of first person, and generally speaking, developers know it's a better way to go that direction because it cuts out a lot of the hassle of extensive character design, animation, and camera work, so a large part of the decision is convenience and practicality. Third person has definitely seen better days, and it's gradually becoming more and more difficult to make it work in comparison to the more accessible and simpler first person perspective, because gamers are now increasingly more aware and even desensitized by certain design principles. For example, Until Dawn was pretty successful in returning to fixed camera angles given it was a more controlled and focused experience, although the argument against it is the fact that the emotional intent of using fixed composition wears down significantly when you get used to it. As ominous as hiding a tracking shot behind trees can be, seeing it constantly makes the tension less effective in the same way that predictable jump scares are ultimately cheap and at the expense of the player. On the other hand, I felt The Evil Within was quite unsuccessful with its third person because its widescreen letterbox composition made everything feel extremely pressed up against your face and ultimately more obnoxious rather than making the isolation and claustrophobia effectively creepy, becoming a case of style over practical substance. But dare I say it, I can see the cynicism in how choosing to go first person is a justifiable cop-out for the sake of increasing scares, but it's still unfair to assume that mentality. Fundamentally, it's easier to scare people when you put them in the character's shoes because it limits their field of vision and makes the experience far more intimate and confrontational. Certainly it's not a discredit given how difficult it is to make a third person game, but it does extract some of the personality. The use of first person means a rejection of an identifiable character we want to protect, which was something so integral to the original Resident Evil games. By seeing them, we connect with them as real people in hazardous situations, and by using the whole "you're the character" is unfortunately wearing down its welcome. But the real question is, do I think Resident Evil will bring back its horror? Well, all signs point to the fact that everything they've obsessed over is survival horror, but in no way am I anticipating it to be something bold, unique, or innovative. In fact, I'm cautiously optimistic that it'll definitely make a great horror game, especially if they use combat and daytime to their advantage, but it will naturally live in the shadows of every haunted house walking simulator that came before it. But maybe they can break the mold. In this day and age, with the way players perceive games, while the game looks like it slots in amongst the saturated market of other first-person horror games, it's a design principle that ultimately still works, and effectively simplifies development. In the words of Todd Howard, you can't simply define a game by certain structures or principles, it has to be defined by the experience developers want players to have, and the developers of Resident Evil 7 know exactly what experience they want you to have. It might reject what was so integral to the original games, and indeed it feels more like an entirely new game using an old name purely for marketing purposes, but things have to evolve or they die. Rarely does anything stay the same way, forever.